chest in my inventory. So if I start to merge some of these, so I'll drag as many of the coins as I can over to this side. All the coins, and then I'll drag all the swords and ring. Hello and welcome to a one-off video on how to make a kind of inventory system or item storage system. It doesn't necessarily have to be an inventory, it could be a chest or a lootable object of any kind. And yeah, this is a one-off video, but my hope is that when I'm doing the 7 days to die video and the Minecraft video and all that stuff, instead of me having to do how to do an inventory within those series, I can just point to this standalone video and just say, that's how you do an inventory. You should be able to just drop it into this project or that project or whatever project, and yeah, all good. So that's the hope for this video. Let's see how that pans out. So before I get started, I just want to quickly say, sorry there was no video last week. If you're interested, I have an EP out with a music act that I'm part of. I will talk more about that at the end of the video. So, onto the code. As you can see here, I have a blank scene. And all I've done in this scene is I have removed the skybox and just made the background black because we don't need any of that. We're purely a UI today. We're not doing anything in 3D space. So it just makes it easier to see what's going on if we have everything black, and obviously deleted the directional light because we don't need that. The only asset that I'm using is this one, Free Game Items by Aninia. I'm sorry, Aninia, if I'm mispronouncing your name there. But yeah, there's some very cool icons, and that's basically all we need for this is just some icons, and using this cool asset saves me having to draw something or use rubbish placeholder assets. So yeah, if you like this, check out Aninia, who is apparently called, oh Jesus, I'm gonna butcher her real name even worse than I butchered her username. Olga. We'll leave it at that. Check out Olga's work. So the first thing we're gonna do is, basically we do this in stages. So we have an item. The item is gonna store the fixed information. So that is information that does not change. A sword is always gonna be a sword. It's always gonna look like a sword. It's always going to have a certain maximum value and a certain maximum condition or whatever other information you put in there. Then above that, we're gonna have the secondary item level, which I'm going to call item slot, but we'll get to that. And that's going to store, first off, it'll store the item so we know what item we're dealing with, and then it stores changeable information. So this is information that could change in the game. So the item would store the max condition, like the maximum the condition could be. The item slot would store the current condition. Then above that, we're going to have a UI item slot, which is the physical representation of the item slot within the game, i.e. an inventory slot that you can click on and drag an item in and out of. And then finally, we have an item container, which is basically just a collection of UI item slots. So let's create a script folder, and we will get into the first of them, which is the item script. We're just going to call it item. So item, because we don't need to do anything with it, and because none of the values are changeable, we're going to make a scriptable object, just to make it a little bit easier to add items. And if you don't know what a scriptable object is, you can kind of think of it as properties. Like, you can do whatever you want in this script. There's no mono behavior, there's no start, awake, update, there's none of that. But you can use it to store values, you can have functions in here and stuff, and you can create it as an asset within your asset menu. So I'll just demonstrate that. First off, you need to tell it that you want to be able to create it as an asset menu type. When you do menu name, if you want it to have its own subcategory, you need to put in a kind of like a folder system. So I'm going to put it in its own little subcategory called inventory. So now if we go back into Unity and we right click somewhere and put create, you can see at the top here we have this new category called inventory and new item, which I can add, but right now it doesn't do anything because we haven't added any code. So I'll just delete that for now. We'll go back to our script and let's add aforementioned code. So first thing we're going to add is a public string for item name. Pretty self-explanatory. So yeah, we can't just use item.name because that already exists. The item.name would be if we created an item here and we called it Goober, item.name would return Goober. That's the name of the actual entity. Whereas this item.name is going to be whatever we call it when we create the item. Another fairly self-explanatory one. Public string item description, and we're going to make this a text area object. And what that will do is if we go back in here, let's just create our folder. So for reasons we'll come to later on, we're going to put this in a resources folder. So if we create a new folder, resources, and then in that folder, just to keep things nice and neat, we're going to create another folder which we'll call items. So let's just create an item for now. Doesn't really matter what it's called. We'll just leave it as new item. So as you can see, we've got item name up here, but then we also have this bigger box, and that's what text area does. It gives us like a larger space to type with. It's just a nice quick way of arranging your inspector without going into the actual editor code. So back into our script, and the next one down is going to be a public sprite, which we're just going to call icon. So I'm going to try and comment as much of this as possible. So this is obviously description of the item, and then this is the icon that shows up in inventory slots. The next one is going to be the maximum amount of this item that we can fit in one slot. We're just going to call that max stack. So yeah, this is the maximum stack of items that you can have in one inventory slot. So like for Minecraft, most of the time that will be 64. This next one, I'm going to add in, I'm trying to avoid adding extra stuff more than what I need, because like you could have all sorts of stuff in here. You could have power, you could have damage, you could have defense, and so on. I'm not going into all of that. I'm just going into what I need to do to show you what I'm showing you. So I'm going to add condition, as in like condition of the item, because that's going to come in later on in the UI part. What I'm showing you here is by no means the limit of what you can do. We're just going to call it public int max condition. So this is assuming that the conditions can vary, like the maximum amount of condition can vary from item to item. So for example, one sword, a weak sword, might have a maximum condition of 60, and a better sword might have a maximum condition of 100. So with this one, what we're going to do is we're going to say, if the item does not degrade, set this value to -1. So if the value is -1, then we're taking that to mean that this item does not degrade, which will come in later on. And then we're just going to add two quick bools, which are going to be, so again with the comment in, so we'll say public bool is stackable, and we're just going to say get return, and then we're going to pass in a condition, and the condition is max stack is greater than 1. So yeah, what this does is if max stack is greater than 1, this will return true. Otherwise it'll return false. So it's just a nice quick way of finding out if the item is stackable without actually looking at the amount, and without storing a separate bool to say whether it's stackable or not. And then same again for condition, which we'll call is degradable, and this time we get return, and the condition we're going to pass in is max condition greater than -1. Anything above -1 is degradable. That's it for now. So if we go back into our Unity project, just delete that item, and we'll create, actually I could have just renamed that item, but we'll create some new ones. So I'm going to create a sword, and these are based on some of the icons in the asset pack that we're using. A ring and a coin, I think the other one was. And we'll fill out the details for these. Item name sword, description, pointy thing. And then for the icon, somewhere in here we have a sword icon. There it is. A max stack, this is going to be 1, because you very rarely can stack weapons like this in these sort of games. Again, these sort of details are entirely down to you. And for condition, I'm just going to put 100. For the ring, just call it ring. Description, pretty, I don't know. It's entirely pointless for this tutorial. Now for the ring, max stack I'm going to put 64, but I'm also going to give it a condition, because we're going to deal with items that are degradable but are different. So you don't really want to be mixing items that have full condition and items that are degraded slightly when you're stacking items together. You want to keep those separate. So for the condition, max condition, we'll just put 50. And then finally, a coin. Spend me coin is here, and then we're going to put max stack 64, but max condition -1. So we have kind of every significant flavor that we're going to have to deal with right now. So let's start creating our UI. So the first thing we're going to need to do is create a UI item, and we want a image. So I'll create that image there. You can see it's automatically created a canvas and an event system. In the canvas, we're going to set this here, canvas scaler. We want this to be scale with screen size. That may change for you depending on what you're doing with it. I'm setting it to that just because it's easier to work with when I'm showing. It doesn't affect how this code works. It just affects how things show up on the screen for me. The way this works is a lot easier. I don't have to worry about the size of the screen because it all scales with it. Whereas if I'm showing you two windows and I just change the size of that slightly, one of the windows may overlap another one and get in the way and stuff. So it's just easier for me to do it this way. So this image we are going to, for now, we're just going to put in the middle. So it's anchored centrally, so it's already, we just put 0 and 0 and that puts it in the middle. We're going to set the size to 50 by 50. Again, this is the sort of stuff that you can play with and make suit you. I'm just going to set the background image to a bit of a light grayish color, and we're going to call it UI item slot. Now inside the item slot, we're going to create another image. And this one is going to be set. If we go up to our anchor presets and you click here, and then you've got all these selections. If you hold down Alt, you can see the selections change. So right now this one is saying anchored to the middle. So wherever you're placing it is relative to the middle. If you hold down Alt, it's anchored to the outsides. So instead of being anchored to the middle, it's anchored to each edge. So you're not placing it relative to the center of the object, you're placing it relative to the edges of the object. So if we click that, you can see that automatically our new image is stretched to the full size of the parent image, which is this UI slot. And then what we can do is we can give it basically padding. So if we put 5 all the way around, you can see it's moving 5 from the edges. And then just so that we're not staring at a weird white box, we'll use the sword just to give it an icon so you can see what it's going to look like, and we'll call that icon. And then we need to create another one, and this one wants to be a text. So I'm going to use Text Mesh Pro. If you don't have to use Text Mesh Pro, none of this really changes if you use the built-in Unity text. If you do use Text Mesh Pro, you may get this dialog box saying that you need to import TMP Essentials. Just go ahead and click that. You don't need to import the extras. You don't need to import TMP examples and extras. That's fine. So, and if you want a font, you'll have to bring in a font. I'm just going to use the standard font for now. Let's change that to 999, just so we can get a feel for how it goes. Now, once again, we're going to stretch it full. We're going to set the font size to, I think, about 14. I'm going to give it a border of 1, so 1 pixel all around. And then if we go down to here, where we've got alignment, we're going to set it to right-hand aligned and bottom aligned. So it just puts it in the bottom corner there like that. And actually for the condition bar, we're going to need to bring this up a bit. So we'll set the bottom to 4, just to raise it up a bit off the bottom. We'll call that the amount. And then finally, we're going to create one more image. And this one, if we click up here, we're going to go with the hold down Alt again. And this time we want this one here. And this one is going to anchor it to the bottom, but stretch it the full width. So now if we set the height to, I think, 3 is it? No, 4 maybe. 4 looks good. And then we set the Y pivot to, I think, 0. And with the Y position to 0. And there it's at the bottom of the screen. And we can just give this just so it looks right for now. We can just give it a bit of a green color, and that's going to represent the position bar. Now, because that's anchored like that, what we can do is we can change the value from the right, and that makes the bar go down. However, we have to do a bit of math to make that work. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to change the anchor to be aligned from the bottom right, like this. And then with our pivots, we're going to set the X pivot to 0, we'll leave the Y pivot at 0, and then what that means is that now it is anchored from the bottom corner to the bottom corner of the outer square. So as long as X is 0 and Y is 0, our condition bar will set itself, in the bottom left hand corner. And then we can set the width to 50, which is the full width of this item slot. Obviously that changes if it's more than 50, but we're going to be dealing with that in code, so that's not important. And then we can just change the width like so. Now that we have the foundation of both our item and our UI elements, we need to create the next 2 components there. So the first of those we're going to call item slot, and maybe it's not the best naming system, but feel free to call it whatever you want. So C script item slot. So this is the behind the scenes part of it. This is basically representing the in-game item live. So this is the one that's got the values that change during the game, but this is all behind the scenes. This is what gets passed around from slot to slot when you're actually moving the item around. This isn't what you're looking at on the screen. This one isn't going to be a mono behavior, so we can get rid of that. So the first one is public item, fairly self-explanatory, and as are the next few. And then we're going to do another quick little bool just to check if this slot currently has an item in it or not. Public bool get return, and then the condition that we're going, oh, sorry, not enough parentheses there, get, return, and the condition we're going to pass in is item does not equal null. So if the item does equal null, this is going to return false, whereas if it doesn't equal null, it will return true. That's saying that we have an item in it, and that needs to be the value, not the class. And also you need to name it. Just testing you. So next, we're going to create a little function for getting an item from the name of the item. So this is why we put our item in a resources folder for what we're about to do now. We'll say private item find by name, and then obviously it's going to take in a string, which we're just going to call item name. So first off, item name is equal to item name dot to lower. And the reason we do this is we're going to, we don't want case to play a factor. So we're going to say make sure string is lowercase and file names too. That way there shouldn't be any issue with, that's not equal, sorry, that's one equal sign. That way we shouldn't run into any problem with capitalization. But like I say, we do need to do the same for here. So where I've carefully capitalized everything, I need to undo that. Okay, the next step is to actually find it. So item, we'll say underscore item equals resources dot load of type item, and then the value that we're going to pass in is string dot format items, which should be the name of our folder. So if you change the name of this folder here, then you're going to need to change this part here, and then that's the value. So that will try, depending on what value we pass in here, that will try and load it from that resources folder. So then we need to check if we actually got an item. So we'll say if item is equal to null, that means we didn't successfully find the item in the resources folder. And then the way we'll do that was just say debug.log warning string.format could not find, and then we're going to do backslash speech mark. So if you didn't know, backslash before a speech mark then makes that speech mark part of the string itself. So if I just put speech mark there, quotation mark, sorry, that ends that string. So anything that happens afterwards isn't part of the string. Whereas if I put, I'll just leave that there. If I put a backslash before it, that is now makes that quotation mark part of the string. So backslash quotation mark, and then again backslash quotation mark, item slot is empty. So all we're saying there is we didn't find the item that you searched for, and there is no item in the slot. And then we're just going to return item. And the next step is to make a constructor. What we're doing here is we're going to say public item slot, and then we're going to say string item name. Now that one we need. We can't initialize without that one, or we can't initialize an actual item slot with an item in it without that one. However, int underscore amount, and we're going to put equals 1. So what that means is when you call this function, you don't actually have to put an amount in if you don't want. If you don't put an amount in, then unit is just going to put 1 in its place. And then exactly the same thing for condition, which we'll say by default is not. You can set your own defaults. So first off, item equals find by name item name, and then we want to make sure we actually have an item. So if item is equal to null, amount equals not, condition equals not, return. So we don't need to set item, oh sorry, we do need to set item to null. So that's basically all that it's saying, is that it couldn't find an item, so set everything to 0 and return. There's nothing else we can do. However, if we did get an item, then we do the same thing, but this time we actually give it the values. So item equals item, amount equals amount, condition equals condition. And we don't need the return there because we're at the end anyway. And then we're going to put in one more constructor, because there are occasions where we're going to need an empty slot, and this one is just going to be a public item slot. It's not going to take in any parameters, and basically it's just going to return this. So if we initialize an item slot without actually giving it any values, it's going to initialize an empty item slot by default. So with that done, let's go to our scripts folder. Just make sure there's no errors actually. We'll clear that. Go back into our scripts folder, and we're going to create the UI side of it. So UI script, and we're going to call this UI item slot, because it's basically the UI side of what we've just created. Now this one is going to be a mono behavior because this is going to exist in the actual physical game world, and this one is going to need to include the TM Pro namespace, because we are actually going to be using the text mesh pro. That's the text mesh pro thing, if you weren't aware, and we're going to be using that. So the first one is public item slot, which is fairly self-explanatory. That's the item slot for this one. Then we're going to need a public image. Oh, sorry, that's another one that we're going to need. We need the Unity UI namespace as well. Public image icon, public text mesh pro Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-I amount, and public image condition. So what we're going to do is we'll save that there just to avoid any unfortunate errors a bit later on. We'll drag that onto our UI item slot now, and we'll just drag these values in before we forget. So icon into icon, amount into amount, and condition, which we haven't actually named yet, so let's name that. Condition, and then condition into condition. That saves me running this later on and getting some embarrassing null reference exception errors. So first off, we're going to need an awake, and this does need to be an awake, not a start, because this needs to happen the second the game loads, or the second the slot loads, sorry. And that's going to be to set a new item slot. So item slot equals new item slot. Now this one hasn't got any values. If you can remember, this part makes a blank item slot, but it means that the item slot itself is not null, because there are times where we need to check the item slot and it can be empty, but the item slot variable cannot be null, because then we get errors. Then in start, we're going to say refresh slot, which we haven't created a function for yet. So that's our next job. And this needs to be public, because we're going to be calling this from outside later on in the code. Refresh slot. So this wants to be if not item slot dot has item. We can disable the icon. We can disable the amount, and we can disable condition. But basically, we can disable everything. So then we'll just get a blank slot. However, if we do have an item, all of this needs to be true. And then we also have to actually set the values. So we'll say icon.sprite equals, and then we want to get item slot dot item dot icon, and then amount dot text equals item slot dot amount, and we're going to have to make it toString, because that is a string and this is an int. So we need to put toString on the end to avoid any mix-ups of type. So just for the time being, if I change this blank declaration here to, let's say, coin, this should work. Let's find out what happens. There we go. We have one coin. And if I make it something that, if I just add 2 random letters on the end there and run it again, so that's something that we haven't got in our items folder. We have an empty slot and we get a warning saying that it could not find, and the item slot is empty. Your code should prevent this from happening where you're looking for an item that doesn't exist. But accidents happen, you never know. Especially when you get into big survival open world type games with multiple people working on it, there's always going to be bugs. So you want to kind of handle them rather than getting null reference exceptions and whatnot. So let's, for now, just set that back to 0. I'll just quickly demonstrate the stack. So if I add that in there, the second value is the amount. We still don't need to put a condition in, but we haven't handled the condition, so it wouldn't matter if we did. But if I press play now, we should have an actual amount. There we go. So we know that works. So for now, I'll just set that back to blank. So we'll do the condition bar next. So the condition bar, we need another value for this, and that value is the width of the actual UI slot. So to get that, the way we're going to do that is we'll say up here, public rect transform, and we'll just call it slot rect. And then if we go into here before we forget, and we'll just drag this in, and it is the very same rect transform that we are using. So we just drag that down from there. And then we're going to create a new function down here. Private void update condition bar. So the first thing we want to do is check for cases where condition bar is not needed. Because there's no point in doing any math to work out how big the condition bar needs to be when there is no condition. If item slot is equal to null, which should never happen, but just in case, because that needs to be first in the list, because if the item slot is somehow null, then the other two checks that we're going to do can't actually be checked because there's no item slot to check them on. So even though that shouldn't happen, we're going to check for it anyway, and we'll put it first because the next one is if item slot does not have any items. Now obviously if item slot is null, then when we try and do this check, we're going to get a null reference exception. So this check needs to be first. And then finally, if item slot dot item dot is degradable, and we put the exclamation point there, so we're saying if it's not degradable. So if we have no item slot for some reason, again, shouldn't happen because we're initializing it right here, so this script shouldn't exist without an item slot, but again, you never know. Or item slot does not have an item in it, obviously condition bar is not necessary if there's no item, or it has an item in it but that item is not degradable. In those cases we don't need a condition bar at all, so then we can just say condition.enabled equals false. So if we do need condition, then the first thing we want to do is enable the condition bar, and then we want to get the normalized value. So this is basically a percentage value between 0 and 1. So instead of 0 to 100%, this is 0 and 1, and then like your 50% will be 0.5, your 25% will be 0.25, and etc. Float condition percent, and that's going to equal, first off we need to recast this as a float, item slot dot condition divided by, again, float item slot dot item dot max condition. So if the current condition is 50% of the full condition, then this is going to return 0.5. Then we want to multiply the max width, which is the width of the slot rect that we got up here, this. So that's the max width of this overall slot. So just to hopefully explain a bit clearer what's going on, we're going to multiply the max width. So right now the max width is 50 because that's the width of the rect transform that we're working on. So if this condition percent was half of the maximum, that would return 0.5. If we multiplied 50, which is the width, by 0.5, we will get 25, which is half of 50. And that's how that works. So float bar width equals slot rect dot width times condition percent. And then finally set the width, and we have to pass in a vector 2. So what that means is we're going to have to get the y value from the very same vector that we're setting to make sure that that stays the same. So condition spelled correctly, condition dot rect transform dot size delta, again this is a vector 2, equals new vector 2 bar width, and then for the y value, again we want to get the existing y value to make sure that doesn't change, size delta dot y. So now let's scoot up to the top here, we'll give this a value again, let's say sod 1. It's not stackable, so right now we have no checks in for that, but we're just going to put 1 because at the minute it will let us stack it because we haven't put in a way to stop it. And then for condition we're just going to put something a bit more obvious, 77. And then if we go down to here, and where we've got condition enabled equals true, instead we're going to call update condition bar. Now if we run that, we can see our condition bar has moved, and if I change this to 34, it should be even less. Now we're not quite out of the woods yet with this one, because if I change this to, let's say 120, I think, did I set this to 100, the maximum condition? I think I did. So if I set this to 120 and I press play, you can see our condition bar breaks out of the side of the UI slot. And obviously we don't want that. So we need to do a bit of validation to make sure that doesn't happen. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to go back into our item slot, and we're going to create a few variables. So we'll go up here, well actually we'll go here. We're going to make this one private and rename it so it's got an underscore on it, and then we're going to make a whole new condition, only this one is going to have some validation in it. So public int condition, and for getting it we're just going to return condition. So this here is basically storing the value, and this is how we access the value. But when we set it, we need to do some checks. So the first check is if item is equal to null, condition equals not. You can't have a condition on an item that doesn't exist. Else if value, and value is how we access the value that's been passed to this variable. So if we say condition equals 12, then when this bit of code here gets run, value is going to equal 12. If value is greater than item dot max condition, then condition equals item dot max condition. So that ensures that it's never more than the max condition. And then else condition equals value. So if we go, actually just go back to here, make sure we still got, yep, so it's still set to 120. However, now if we press play, it should be capped. As you can see, it's not gone over 100, because when we try and set the condition value, this code here runs and makes sure that it never goes over max condition. And obviously it sets it to 0 if there is no item there. And you could run other checks, you know, there's all sorts of code you could put in here. And then just to add a little bit of flair to it, what we're also going to do is if we go back to our update condition bar, and at the bottom here, we're going to say lerp color from green to red as it becomes more degraded. So condition dot color equals color dot lerp, and then we're going to lerp from color dot red, color dot green, and obviously you could pass in whatever colors you want here. I'm just using dot red and dot green because it's easy. Condition percent. So if you remember, our condition percent is a 0 to 1 value, so whatever the percentage is between 0 and 1, that's what that value is. So if it was 0.1, it would be 90% red and 10% green. If it was 0.9, it would be 10% red and 90% green, and so on and so forth. So if we run it now, we should find we have a green bar, possibly a brighter green bar because it's a different shade of green. But if we change this value to, let's say, 12, you can see it's gone red. And just to show it off a little bit, we'll just create a little coroutine. We can put it anywhere. We're just going to delete this immediately afterwards, but just for the sake of it, i.e. numerator temp degrade, and then in here we're just going to say while item, we're going to put brackets around it, while item slot dot condition is greater than not, item slot dot condition minus minus, refresh slot, and then say yield return new, wait 4 seconds, and then I think 0.05 is a good value. And then in start, we're just going to say start coroutine temp degrade. We want to set this to 100, otherwise it's not going to be much of a demonstration. So if we run this now, we should find our bar degrading over time. And as it gets lower, it gets darker, turns orange, then red, and it's gone. That's our condition bar sorted, so let's just immediately delete all that code because yeah, that was just to show that off. It's of no practical value. Now the other thing is we have this, oh I didn't save that, it's showing 1, but we don't really need it to show a value. Just save that. We don't really need it to show a value if there is only 1 item in the slot. A lot of games don't bother showing an amount when there's only 1, so let's do that as well. So we're going to do the same thing for our update amount that we did for our update condition bar. We're going to create a function for it. So private void update amount, and once again we're going to do all these checks here, only this time instead of is degradable we want to say if item slot dot amount is less than 2, get rid of that exclamation mark there, then amount dot enabled equals false, else first thing we want to enable it, second thing we want to say amount dot text is equal to item slot dot amount dot to string. And then if we go up here to where we are setting the amount, which is here, instead of actually setting the amount we can just call update amount. So if we go back up here and we set this to, well, it's already set to 1. So if we run this, we can say we no longer have a number showing for when the item has only got 1 item in the slot. However, if I change this value to, let's say 12, we can see we still have a problem because a sword is only stackable to 1, or in other words is not stackable, yet it's letting us display 12. So let's handle that, and we can do that simply if we go into item slot. We do a similar thing to what we did here. Set this to private underscore that, and then we create a new one, public int amount, and then we just return the underscore amount, and then for setting it we just need to say if amount is greater than item.maxStack. Amount equals item.maxStack. And that should prevent the item ever having more in one slot than is actually allowed by the stack. So even though, I think we're still setting 12 in there, yeah? So even though we've told it 12, it's set 1 because 12 is more than the amount of swords that you can have in one slot. And then just to clean this up a bit, we're going to make one more function, try and keep everything commented. Private void update icon. And all this one needs to know is that 1, we have an item slot, and 2, that that item slot has an item. So if item slot does not equal, if item slot equals null, or item slot does not have an item, so exclamation point, item slot has item, icon.enabled equals false. And then else icon.enable equals true. Should be fairly obvious what's going on now. Icon.sprite equals item slot.item.icon. And now in refresh slot we can basically streamline all of this because we don't need to do any of these. This has item check here because these have all got their own checks. So we'll just delete all of this and then we can just call update icon, update amount, and update condition bar. Now that we've got that sorted, let's get some drag and drop going. So first things first, we need a way of identifying whether something is a UI slot. Oh, sorry, let's just have a look at this. Sorry, this should be underscore amount there. No, that could have been bad. There we go. So the first thing we need is a way of identifying whether our mouse is over a UI slot. In order to do that, we need a way of identifying the UI slot. So the easiest way to do that, I think, is to tag it. So if we click on our UI slot here and we go to tags, add tag, and we have a list here to add it. So we want to click on this little plus here and we're just going to call it UI item slot. Then go back to our UI item slot and set that tag. We don't want these tagged as UI item slots. So if we look on UI item slot here and we go down to, or up to here, raycast target, this is set to true. We want to leave that set to true. So we're going to use a raycast to detect where the mouse is on the screen. The raycast is only going to detect things that are set to be a raycast target. So this will be detected by a raycast. This icon here, however, as soon as we uncheck this button here, that will no longer be detected by a raycast. Same for condition, turn that off. And then for amount, because it's a Text Mesh Pro, you have to scroll down a bit, go to extra settings, and then it's down here. So that means that when we raycast, none of these 3 components will be detected. This, however, will. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to, in our resources folder, create a new folder, which we're going to call prefabs. And we're going to go into that folder and then we're going to drag our UI item slot into it as well and make that into a prefab. Then we're going to drag that straight back out, and this one we're going to call cursor slot. We'll just move this to the side just so it's separated from the other one, and we want to immediately unpack this because we're going to change it, but we don't want it to change the prefab. The prefab needs to stay as it is. That's why we've just made it a prefab now. This needs to be slightly different, but we don't want it affecting the original one. So if we click unpack prefab, that makes it no longer affected by the prefab or linked to it in any way. And the first thing we're going to do is in our main part where the UI item slot script is, we want to delete the image component there. We don't want a background on this one. And then the next thing is the condition bar, because we're not going to display a condition bar on the mouse cursor drag. So again, remove component on the image. Now this cursor slot needs to be at the bottom of the canvas hierarchy all the time. Because right now, as you can see, if I click on cursor slot and I drag it here, it's showing up over the top of this slot. This is going to be the mouse, so when we're dragging, this is what's going to be getting dragged around by the mouse. However, if we drag it above UI item slot, it's now behind it. Obviously, that's no good. So regardless of what we put into this canvas, cursor slot needs to be at the bottom. We'll just save that. And then we're going to go back into our script. And at the top of our UI item script, we're going to add a bool. Public bool is cursor. Because for this to work neatly, we need the cursor slot to have a UI item script. But being the cursor, it will behave differently. So the first thing we're going to change is if we come down here, we're going to say if not is cursor. So only if it is not the cursor do we update the condition bar. And then we're going to go up to here and we're going to create an update function. And in the update function, all we're going to say is if not is cursor, return. If we're not the cursor, we don't need an update function, so just return out of it straight away. However, if we are the cursor, I'm going to say transform dot position equals input dot mouse position. Now if we go back to cursor slot and make sure that that is checked, and then make sure that this one isn't, when we press play, we can see that this is being dragged around, and we no longer have a condition bar, and we no longer have an amount, because that part still works. It's still removing the amount when there is only one of them. So let's handle the clicking, and in order to do that, we're going to need a new script, and this script is going to be called click handler. So in here, we're going to need to bring in the Unity engine dot event systems namespace, and then we're going to need a few references to some weird sounding things right now, at least to me. So first off is graphic raycaster. Graphic raycaster actually uses the UI namespace, so we're going to need that as well. So Unity engines.ui. We're going to need a pointer event data, which I'm just going to call pointer, and we're going to need a event system, which we'll just call event system. Next, a public UI item slot, which we're going to call cursor. So to populate our values in awake, again, it needs to be awake, this one. Raycaster equals get component graphic raycaster. And the reason we can use get component is because we are going to put this script onto our canvas. So if we drag click handler onto canvas, you can see right above where the click handler script is a graphic raycaster component. And that is the one we need, obviously, because we've only got the one canvas. So that handles that part. And then event system, because we're only going to be doing this once, I'm just going to use game object dot find event system dot get component event system. And you could make that a public reference and drag that in, but this way is just a bit quicker. And your event system's there, by the way. It's automatically created by Unity when you create a UI element. And also, while we've got it here, I'm just going to drag the cursor slot into it so that I don't forget. There. So now we need an update function. Say if input dot get mouse button down mouse 0. First off, we need to set up new pointer event at mouse position. And we do that by saying pointer equals new, not pointer, pointer equals new pointer event data, and we're passing in event system. Pointer dot position equals input dot mouse position. So this is all unrelated to the code in UI item slot, where it's just setting the position of this to the mouse position. This is completely independent of that. So if you messed up one of these scripts somehow, you could quite easily find yourself in a position where this is following the mouse and maybe this isn't, or vice versa. So that's something to be careful of. So then we need to create a list. So list of raycast results, which we're going to call results, equals new list raycast results, or result. And then we're going to populate that list by raycasting from our pointer. We do that by saying raycaster dot raycast pointer results. So we're saying raycast from this position and put the results in this list. And then just to show this in action, here we're just going to say for each raycast result in results debug.log result.gameObject.name. So if we run this now, pull console up so we can see. If I run this now and I click, say, here, nothing happens. But if I click here, you can see it's picked up the UI item slot. Now, if I change, we're going to here, and I change icon and condition back to raycast targets, and this back to a raycast target when I remember where it is. There it is. And then I click on these again, you can see it's picked up all three of them. Or it's picked up 2 of them because I didn't click on, because there's no amount to click on at the minute. But it's picked up the item slot and the icon, which is why we set these to not be raycast targets, because we don't want it to do that. So let's get rid of this. That was just to show you it working. And now let's use the actual code. So say we're only interested in the first thing the raycast hits, because if for some reason you've put something in the UI in front of the raycast, we're not going to be raycasting through it to get to the, well, I mean, maybe you would be. I suppose it depends on what you're doing with the UI system, but the chances are if something's in front of the UI item slot, you don't want to be casting through it at the UI item slot. So when it does hit something, we also want to make sure that it's not something other than a UI item slot before we run this code. If results.count is greater than 0, so that's saying that we actually have results, and results 0, so this is the first one, dot game object dot tag is equal to UI, it needs to be in speech marks, UI item slot, then process click. This is a function we haven't created yet, don't worry, we will create it in a second. And then we're going to pass in results 0 dot game object dot get component UI item slot. And then let's go make this process click function. This can be a private void process click UI item slot, and we'll just call this clicked. Random bracket there. So the first thing we want to do in here is catch any null errors. So say catch null errors. And what this is we're assuming when we pass this to this function that there is a UI item slot component here. Now, this could return null if somehow something has been tagged as a UI item slot, but is not a UI item slot and doesn't have this component on it. Now, if we just carry on with this code without checking for that, then we could end up with null reference exception, and nobody wants that. So we'll say if clicked is equal to null, then debug.log UI element tagged as UI item slot but has no UI item slot component. And then we just return, because there's nothing, once we know there's nothing, no UI item slot in this object, then we can't do anything with it anyway here, so we just return. And then down here we'll just to show it in action, debug.log clicked dot item slot dot item dot item name. So if I press play now, we've got our console open, and I click on this, it says sword because there is a sword in that slot. However, if I create a new image, there we go, and I'll just move that to the side, and I tag this as UI item slot, when I click it, we get a little error here, and actually we can make that a warning. Debug log warning. So once again, I shall create a little image, pull this over to the side here, tag it as UI item slot, and then when I click it, we get a warning here. As you can see, because I put this image below the cursor slot, our cursor actually disappears behind it. So that's what I was saying about making sure the cursor slot is always at the bottom of the canvas hierarchy. So assuming now that we have an item slot and it has we have a UI item slot and it, you know, it's all set up correctly when we've clicked on it, we need a way of checking two items against each other. So back into our code, we're going to go into item slot. We'll just go down here somewhere, that'll do. And we're going to make a public static bool, which we're just going to call compare. It will take in two item slots, slot A and item slot B. So all it's saying is if the items themselves or the conditions of the items are different, then they are treated as different. So this is returning compare. We're going to return true if they are the same and false if they are different. So if slot A.item does not equal slot B.item, and this will also ring true if they are null. So if one is null and one is not, that will still return false. Slot A.condition does not equal slot B.condition, return false, and then otherwise return true. Nice and simple. And then what we're also going to need is a function for swapping over the contents of an item slot. So once again, public static, only this time it can just be a void, and we're going to call this swap. And I'll just copy this here. Once again, slot A and slot B. So first thing we want to do is cache slot A's values. So create a new item, which we're just going to call underscore item so as not to conflict with anything up here. And that's going to equal slot A dot item, and then int underscore amount equals slot A dot amount, and then finally int underscore condition equals slot A dot condition. So now that we've cached them, we can copy slot B's values into slot A. And that's going to be slot A dot item equals slot B dot item, slot A dot amount equals slot B dot amount, and slot A dot condition equals slot B dot condition. Remember to spell everything correctly. And then finally, we can copy the values that were originally in slot A into slot B. And the last thing we want to do is to refresh the slots. So slot A dot refresh UI slot, and slot B dot refresh UI slot. Now we're getting an error because we haven't created this refresh UI slot function yet. So we'll do that next. We go to item slot, and up here somewhere, just go below condition. We want to create a private UI item slot, which we'll just call UI item slot, as we're going to need that. And then we want a public void attach UI, and that's going to take in a UI item slot value. And all it does is it sets the value that we just created here to the value that we've passed in here. And then we also want the alternate to that, which is a public void detach UI. That one doesn't need to take in any values, and all that says is UI item slot equals null. And I appear to have stuck an unnecessary bracket there. So the function that I came here to do is public void refresh UI slot. Doesn't need to take anything in. Doesn't need to be spelled correctly though. So first thing we check is if UI item slot. You know what? Let's make a quick little bool just the same way we did before, just for ease sake. Public bool is attached to UI, and all it's going to be is get return, and the condition is going to be UI item slot does not equal null. And then here we can use that, we'll just say if not is attached to UI. And if that is the case, if it is not attached to UI, then we return. Otherwise, UI item slot dot refresh slot. So now we've created that, we can go back into our click handler and we can get rid of this and we can start implementing our actual code. So the first thing we say is if item slots are different, we can just swap them. So it doesn't matter what's in them, all we know is that each of them are different. So if we clicked one slot onto another slot and the items are different, we'll just swap the contents of them over. So the way we check for that is if not. So if you remember, we made this, let's say you remember, it was about 3 seconds ago. We made these two new functions, wherever they are, here and here, swap and compare static. So what that means is we don't have to access a specific instance of item slot. We can just say item slot, like the actual class. Compare, and then we're going to pass in cursor.itemSlot and clicked.itemSlot. And then within that if statement, we're going to say item slot, once again, the class, not an instance. Swap, and once again, we're going to pass in cursor.itemSlot and clicked.itemSlot. And then we're going to return because there's going to be more code after this and there's no point in running it once we've already decided what we're doing. So just to see this in action, if we just go up to here, and what we'll say is if is cursor, then do that. else, and we'll just give it a different item. It doesn't really matter what, as long as it's different to the first one. So let's give it coin. It doesn't matter what the condition is there. And then we'll say 58. And then if we run this, we have an error. Where have I missed a bracket off here? There we go. So if we run it now, we'll see that not a right lot happens when we click. And that's because we've implemented these refresh slots, but we aren't actually calling them anywhere. So we need to find where we need to call them. And basically any place where the value is changed, we need to call refresh slot or refresh UI item slot, depending on where we are. So one thing we'll want to check, if we go into item slot, we're going to just update amount here. We're going to make this a little bit more complicated, a little bit more comprehensive. So we'll drop this down. Gives a bit more space. And so we have the first check, which is if item is equal to null, then amount is going to equal 0. Else if value, so this is the value that has been passed, is greater than item.max stack. Well, actually this is this value here, this is this line here, so we'll just keep that rather than retyping it out. Lord knows I've done enough typing already in this video. And then we'll say else if value is less than 1, amount is equal to 0. And then finally, else amount equals value. And then we're also at the bottom of here, we're going to call refresh UI slot. And then we're going to do the same in condition. Remember, this calling refresh UI slot won't actually do anything if it's not attached to a UI, so we don't need to worry about that. And then the next thing we need to do to make sure that all these calls to refresh UI slot work is in the top of our UI item slot. After setting these items here, we need to actually attach it. So if we say item slot dot attach UI, and we're just saying this, attach it to this. So now, hopefully, if we run it, we should find we can click on our items. There we go. As you can see, the condition bar comes and goes depending on which item's in it. So we're starting to get there. It's only taken Lord knows how long after editing. I won't tell you how long it's taken me to get to this point without editing. So we're just going to item slot. We're just going to add one more function to make life a little bit easier. And that function is going to be called public void clear. It's probably fairly obvious what this is going to do, and this just gives us a quick and easy way of emptying the slot essentially. Amount equals 0, condition equals 0, and then obviously anytime we change all the values we want to refresh the UI slot. So back to click handler, we can continue with our cases in effect, this because that's kind of what this is. We're handling different situations. So the next one, so this check was to say, are the items different? So that's what we do if the items are different. However, our next one is else are the items the same? And if the items are the same, we need to do some other checks. So the first thing we want to do is to make sure that we're actually dealing with items and not empty slots, because remembering this just compares if the two slots are the same. They could both be empty and they would be the same. So if, well, let's just grab one. So we know they're both the same if we get this far. So if cursor dot item slot dot has item, I'll say if not has item. So if not has item, then just return. And then because we know if we get to this point that both slots have the same both slots are the same, and we know that this slot has an item, if we get past this point, then we don't have to worry about null reference exceptions. So the first thing we're going to do is if, and again, it doesn't matter whether we use cursor or clicked because we know they're both the same and we know they both have an item in them. So we'll just use cursor again. If cursor dot item slot dot item dot is stackable, so we've got the exclamation point at the start there, so that means that if this returns true, it's not stackable. Then once again return, because both items are identical, so the only thing we can do with two items that aren't stackable is swap them over, but they're identical, so there's no point in swapping them over because you can't tell because they're identical. So that's another return case. So the next case scenario that we're going to look at is the amounts, basically. So if we've got to this point, we know that both slots have an item, we know that both items are identical. The only thing we've got left to play with is the amounts. So we always assume that the player, when clicking on an inventory slot, is, or at least I always do, is trying to put the item into the inventory slot. So if you have 12 rings in the inventory slot and you have 3 rings in the cursor slot, you assume that the player is trying to put the 3 rings into the inventory slot with the other 12, not trying to pick the 12 rings up. If the player has an empty cursor slot, you know, the player isn't dragging anything around, then you assume he's trying to pick the 12 rings up. But if you're carrying one amount and you click on an inventory slot, you assume he's trying to put them down. So with that in mind, the first thing we're going to check is if clicked.itemslot.amount is equal to clicked.itemslot.item.maxStack, then we can return again, because what that means is that the click slot is already full. We can't put anything more in it, so just do nothing. So now we need to get into a bit of actual jiggery pokery with the mass. So otherwise we add up the amounts and put as much as we can in the clicked slot, leaving the rest with the cursor. So we'll get a total amount, and the total amount is simply going to be cursor.itemslot.amount plus clicked.itemslot.amount. So we'll try and spell amount correctly. And then the next one we want is, just for ease, maxStack equals, and again you can grab either of these values, either cursor or clicked. We know they're both the same at this point. Cursor.itemslot.item.maxStack. Basically, the only reason we're doing this is to save us typing all this out every time we need it. And then we're going to say if total is less than or equal to maxStack, then that means that all of what is already in the click slot and all of what is in the cursor slot together will all fit in one slot. So in that case, we just say clicked.itemslot.amount is equal to total. And remember, because we changed our amount value here, it automatically refreshes the UI slot when we change that value. So we don't need to worry about that. So we'll set that to total, and then we just say cursor.itemslot.clear, and we just empty the cursor slot. So if the total is less than the max stackable amount, then we know we can put it all in this slot, clear this slot, done. And then we can return from there. However, if the amount is too big to fit in 2 slots, then this means that it is more than the max stackable amount. So we're going to say clicked.itemslot.amount equals max stack, and then cursor needs to equal what is left. So itemslot.amount equals total minus max stack. And that's that. So if we go up here and we change, no, sorry, not up here, up here, and we change both of these to, let's just say coin, and we change the amounts. So we'll make, first off, let's make it 12 and 3. We can see we can put them both together and then pick it all up. And if we test that again, but this time we'll make this value 60. So we should be able to put, what was that, 48 of these down. So we should be left, oh no, sorry, 52 of these down. And that leaves us with 8. And now we can't do anything with this one because we can't put 8 more into this slot because that slot is full. So now we're ready to create a kind of inventory window type thing. So basically we want to delete all of this, and we're just going to replace that with item slot equals new item slot, just so we never have a null item slot, because we don't want that at all. Even if it's got no item in it, it needs to exist. We don't need to refresh the slot. That will be handled by anything that we change. However, we do want to, if we just open this up, click on UI item slot, open prefab, we do actually want to disable these by default. And also I'm just going to delete these values because there's no point in having them there. There, so the default state of this now is disabled. And now that we've done that, we can delete this. And then we're going to do the same for cursor. We just want to disable, set these to 0 and disable the amount. So delete the condition, we don't need that. And then the image, disable that, and I'll just take that reference away as well. Now we're going to create a new UI panel. So UI panel, and it's automatically going to put it underneath at the bottom. We want to drag it above the cursor slot, as I said before. The panel we're just going to call item container. We're going to have it anchored centrally, and Let's give it a, I think 390 by 250 was a good size. Sorry, I've got that on a stretch. It should be on this middle one here. So that's anchored to the center, not stretched to the sides. So we want the width to be 390 and the height to be, what did I say, 250. And I'm just going to delete this background image because I'm not very keen on the curved images. I prefer nice, crisp, clean edges. We'll just make this a little bit darker. And then in here, we're going to create a text element. So UI, Text Mesh Pro, call that container name. Set the font size to 16 and I'm going to anchor it to the top but stretch it full width and give it a height of 20, not 2. Set this to 1. I should be able to anchor that to the very top. I'm going to give it a bit of a border all the way around. So this wants to be -5. Make it bold and align it to the right. It doesn't matter for this, we're just making it look something like. So we'll just rename that container name, and then we're going to create another one, and this one is going to be a panel once more, and this time we're just going to delete the background image entirely. We don't want that. We want to fully stretch it across the entire of the item container, and then we're going to give it a top margin of, I think it should be 30. Yeah, 30. So that just, if you can see there, the boundaries of this panel that we've just created just misses the top container title area thing. So we'll just call this content. And then we need to add to this a grid layout group. We're going to set the size to 50 and the spacing to 5. And all of this is fine as it is. Upper left, horizontal. Yeah, that should all be fine. So just to show you it in action, if I grab our prefab UI item slot and drop it in the content, and then I just duplicate these, you can see it automatically lines them up in a grid layout. And we do actually need a border on this. So I'll just give this a 5 pixel border either side. That just centers it nicely. So I'll delete all these again because they're not going to do anything until we've got some code behind it. So before we get into the code, let's just, before we forget, remember to set these to not be raycast targets. So content doesn't have an option to be a raycast target, I don't think. However, container name will. So container name is in extra settings, and then I think item container does as well. Yeah, so turn those off. And now let's create another script. So create the script item container. First thing we're going to do in here is grab a reference to a transform, which will be, we're just going to call window. No, we'll call it content window. Basically, in this much the same way that we attach item slots to UI item slots, this item container script represents the code part of it, and this transform is kind of a link to the UI part of it. The difference is that the UI part of it for the container doesn't necessarily need any code of its own. It just needs to be passed to this script, and this script can handle it all. So when you right now we're going to write all of it in this code that you can see here, but when you're doing an actual game, whenever you wanted to open a container, you would hand over the content window, whatever it is. In this case, it is this item container. You would pass it into this script, and then this script would populate that window with the items in this item container. So we're just going to make a start function, and the first thing we're going to do is grab that slot prefab. So slot prefab equals, and again, the reason that we put the items and the prefab in the resources folder is so that we could just do this. Game object, and then we find prefabs / inventory slot. Actually, what did I call it? I don't think I called it that, did I? No, I called it UI item slot. So it needs to be obviously the right name. So that should grab us our prefab for our UI item slot without having to actually put a reference to it in the inspector or anything. And then we're just going to say for int I equals 0, I is less than, let's say, 10. Doesn't matter for now, this is just for demonstration purposes. And then in that for loop, we're just going to say game object new slot equals instantiate slot prefab, and then we're going to use content window as a parent. And setting it as parented to this means that it will all be inside this grid layout group object, so it'll all get organized by itself. So let's just grab that script and let's drop it onto canvas. Where you would put this script would depend on the way your game works, but I would imagine I would put it on the object that is the container. So the chest or the dead body, whatever you're looting. Yeah, I'm just going to drop it on canvas for now because I don't have any of those elements in the game. So let's just grab the reference to that. Wherever the canvas, item container. No, sorry. I want to be passing, I need to be passing it this content window here because that's what needs to be the parent. So I'll drag that in there. And there you go. You can see they're all populated in the window, and because it's got this grid layout group thing on, they're automatically sorted. So now that we've got that basic premise set up, we can start actually making this script do something useful. So let's get a reference to TM Pro. And then with that, we can get a text mesh pro yugi for the title. And then down here we can say public string, we can get some more details, public string container name, pretty self-explanatory. And then finally we're going to have a list of item slots. Now if you were inclined to break the data away from this script and hold it elsewhere, this list would be the sole part that you would need to move. So we're going to create a function that takes in this list, but we're going to pass the list in as a parameter rather than just accessing this list directly. So what that means is you could just have one instance of content window of the item container script just on the content window itself on the UI element, and then you could just pass in this list and you could just store the list elsewhere. How you implement that is entirely up to you. For now, we're just going to have it in this script because, like I say, we haven't got any other game elements to be attaching things to. So it's going to equal a new list item slot. And then in start, we're still going to get our UI item slot prefab like we did before. We can delete this, and then we're going to put a temporary call to the function that I just mentioned that we haven't created yet, and it's going to take in the items list that we've created, and then we'll create the function. But first we need another list, and this list we'll just put down here. It's a UI item slot list. I'm just going to call it UI slots. I'm going to remember to put all the brackets on. It's going to equal a new list UI item slot, and then the function itself, public void populate container UI, and it's going to take in a list item slot which we'll call slots. So the first thing we'll do is we'll say title.text equals container name, and just for appearances we'll say to upper to make it all caps lock. So next, loop through each item. So for int equals not, for int I equals not, I is less than slots.count, I++, and then we're going to say game object new slot equals instantiate slot prefab, and we're passing our parent that I've already forgotten the name of, content window, as our parent. And then just in case we ever need to distinguish between, I mean we shouldn't need to, but just in case we ever need to distinguish which slot we are looking at in relation to this list, because usually it can just access itself, it's not really important, we're just going to give it a name. So new slot dot name equals I dot toString. So then you can pass the name backwards to get the ID within the list that this slot is. We don't actually need to do that in this tutorial, but in case that's ever something that's useful, there it is. And then we're going to say UI slots.add new slot.get component UI item slot. And we know it's got a component because we made the prefab, so we don't need to worry about that. And then finally, slots I dot attach UI, and then we're passing in UI slots I. So if we go back in, technically, well, first off, we need to pull in some references. Well, one reference. So let's get the container name and drop that in there. And let's set the name to my inventory. So if we run it, not a right lot's going to happen. We can say the name's right, but we don't have any item slots. And the reason for that is because we haven't created any. I'm not quite sure why I'm getting an error there, given that that's the only part of the code that is currently working. But anyway, let's finish the rest of it and then see if we can work out where that error has come from. So just to make a temporary way of seeing this in action, above populate container, but below the prefab, we're going to just create some temporary code. So region demonstration code. Then we're going to create a little array. Temp items equals new item, and we've only got 3 items, so it only needs to be 3 long. Then we'll say temp items O equals resources dot load item. I'm going to say items / sword. That needs to be lowercase, doesn't it? And then we'll do the same for 1 and 2, only this time we'll put the ring and the coin in. And then after that, we'll do a quick for loop. For int I equals 0, I is less than, let's say 14, just for argument, it's completely arbitrary at this point. This number would obviously depend on the size of your container that you're opening. I++. And then in here we'll say int index equals random.range. We have 3 choices, so 0 to 3. Because this isn't a float in here, then this number is exclusive, so it will not go to 3. It will actually go from 0 to 2 will be your actual choices, which works perfectly for an index. And then int amount equals random.range, and then the range is between 1 and temp items index, so that's the item that we're actually going to use, dot max stack. So it's getting a random range somewhere between 1 and whatever the maximum amount of this particular item we can have. And then int condition just equals temp items index dot max condition. No point messing around with condition for now. And then we're going to say items dot add new item slot temp items index dot name. So we're kind of reverse engineering it a bit there. That's going to create us a new, when we put enough brackets in, that's going to create us a new item slot to add to the list. So we're not quite ready to run it yet. If we go back to UI item slot, and we're going to put a clear slot in here somewhere. So let's go here just below refresh slot. So public void clear slot, and then it's just going to be item slot equals new item slot, so essentially clearing the item slot, and then refresh slot. And then if we go back to item slot and we find our attach UI functions, we're just going to extend these a little bit, and all we're going to do is add in here refresh UI slot. This one is UI item slot dot clear slot, and then UI item slot dot null. Obviously you can't clear a UI item slot after you've detached it, because then you can't access it.
One eternity later.
So after an impromptu little debugging session that you won't have seen through the magic of editing, there are 2 little errors that need fixing before we can continue. Firstly is just after this line in click handler process click function, we need to here call cursor dot refresh slot. And the other little error is in item slots. We need to find, I might have already done it actually, yeah, sorry, this line here I hadn't put in. So the problem with this is we were saying that we were attaching the UI slot, the UI item slot to this item slot, but we weren't telling the UI item slot what its item slot was, and it was sticking with the blank one that it was given on start. So, as I say, through the magic of editing, you don't know how long it's been me rooting through the code trying to figure out exactly what I'd done wrong, but anyway, now that that's dealt with, we can continue. So we need to head over to item container, and I think where we got left off was I was about to make it so we can open and close the window. So if we go to the top here and we bring in a public game object reference, and we're just going to call parent window, and then we'll immediately come drag this in before we forget. So canvas, and down there, and the parent window is the item container window. And then we're going to come down to the bottom and we're going to create a closed container script. So public void close container, doesn't need to take in any values. And then we're going to loop through each slot and attach delete. So for each UI item slot in slots, UI slots even. slot.item/slot.detach/UI, and then destroy slot.gameObject. So that detaches the item slot safely from the UI, so the data is still around and available, but it's no longer attached to the UI, so it won't try and update it if the data gets changed. And then once we've done that, we can then safely delete the UI element. So we'll clear the list by simply UI slots.clear, and then we deactivate this window. Then if we come up to populate container UI, we're going to rename that to open container and delete this reference from the start function. And then we're going to create an update function. And in the update function, we're going to say if input.get key down keycode.q. It really doesn't matter what key you use. I'm just going for the one that was nearest to my finger at the time. Close container. Else if input.get key down keycode.w open container. We need to pass in the list of items. The last thing we should need to do with this is to just put a reference in here to actually activate the window when we open it. So parent window dot set active true. Try this now. Hopefully we should have a working window. So if I press W, and if I click, we can pick up items and drop them. And if I merge items of the same type, okay, something's not quite right. Okay, that problem is caused, one, we don't want this return here, and two, we want to be calling cursor.refresh slot here. Sorry, this has been a very long video and there's been a lot to remember. So once again, press play, load up our items, and now I'll pick the coins. I should be able to offload all of these coins into different stacks. And I can't do anything with these, but everything else appears to be working correctly. And if I close this and then reopen it, you can see everything is still where I left it. So I'll just do a quick demonstration to show the item slots are all sort of independent. So it doesn't really matter if you save it, you know, as a container. It's just a collection of item slots. So I'll show you what I mean. If I duplicate this item container here, and I'll just pull one off to one side and another off to the other. It really doesn't matter which one's which. What does matter is that it's tried to put the item container below the mouse. This one I'll give a different name. Duplicate this here, grip, because we've like I say, this is a hacky way of doing it just to show everything working. We'll call this one chest, and we need to drag the right information into it here. So the title, content window, and the parent window. So as you can see, I've got my misspelt chest and my inventory. So if I start to merge some of these, so I'll drag as many of the coins as I can over to this side. All the coins, and then I'll drag all the swords and rings over to this side. Nearly all of them, because I can't fit them all. Oh yes, I can. Then if I close them and reopen them, you can see everything exactly where it is, because it's the item slots that are storing the information. And that is where I'm going to call this video quits. The only thing left to do in the video proper is to thank my amazing Patreon, of which there are now 9. Wait. Just have to cut in here from the editing booth. There's no editing booth, it's just my desk. I've just had to cut in here because this video has taken so long to record and edit that there's actually now 10 Patreons, not 9. So yeah, I thought I'd better cut in here and give an updated thank you to the Patreons, because as I say, there are now 10 of you, which is amazing. You're all spectacular people. Thank you for all the support. And obviously the people supporting at the sugar daddy / mama level get the extra thanks. Those people now consist of the obvious long-time supporter Professor DJ, Dave Moldine, Michael Gulak, Reg Reed, Gabriel White, and newest addition, literally an hour ago I think, Neil Rankin. Thank you all. I'm sorry this video kind of of petered off at the end a bit. I was dying of sleep exhaustion. If I do another long video like this, it will be planned out better. But anyway, back to the video. So that's the end of the video. You don't need to stick around for this little bit. All I'm going to say is if you are interested in, or potentially interested in the EP that me and my friend who we together make up, Fantastic Mr. Fox, the band act duo thing, then all the links can be found. I will put them in the description. It's kind of a folk indie type thing. It's been a bit of a labour of love. We've been at this for a while now, and things just ramped up over the last month, and we went from 0 to 5 tracks in a very relatively short amount of time. So that was the reason that I was sort of AWOL last week, because I was stressing around trying to get that done. But it's done now. It's out. It's on all the major streaming platforms. It's on a bunch of minor ones. It's due to come out on even more platforms that, to be honest, I'm not that bothered about because I don't know anybody who uses them. But it's on like your Spotify's and your iTunes and all that sort of thing. So that's the main thing. So yeah, I would greatly appreciate anyone who wants to give it a listen. There's plenty of ways you can do it for free. It's on Bandcamp. It's on Spotify. Thanks for watching. If you stuck around to this point, thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. I'm gonna go pass out. Bye bye.
Whoa, it's fine.